In the aftermath of the Zondo Commission, which cost the taxpayer over R1 billion, the question has always been, well, when will the Hawks and the National Prosecuting Authority start arresting people? The NPA's investigating directorate, the ID, was created in mid-2019 with that express purpose in mind, to go after the looters the country's media has been writing about for years, and whose names were repeated day after day in testimony before the state capture inquiry. In a series of interviews we've packaged together for you, we focus on recent high-profile arrests linked to state capture and ask the question whether South Africans, starved of accountability for wrongdoing for years, finally have something to celebrate, or whether we should temper those expectations. Rudy Heineke, Portfolio Manager on State Capture at the organization Undoing Tax Abuse. It's a pleasure to speak to you this morning. It's under good circumstances that we speak to each other. I've seen former Transnet executives appearing in the dock. They waited for me to leave the country before they made these arrests. I was happy to arrive back in South Africa to see a number of arrests taking place. Charges are fraud, corruption, money laundering, contravention of the PFMA. And I'd like to name exactly who it is. It's the former Group Chief Executive of Transnet, Siyabonga Gama, the former Acting Group CFO, Gary Pitter, former Group Treasurer, Petolo Ramosabudi, Regimen shareholder Eric Wood, Trillion Asset Manager and Director Daniel Roy, who also seems to work for a company called Novum Asset Management. Recent arrests, Rudy, is it to be celebrated or is our optimism premature?
Well, it had to come some other time, and we are very happy to see that it finally, took place, and that some people are appearing in court. Maybe a bit too early to celebrate. This we must remember. These are arrests. There's a whole court case and a trial, and that must take place before there's a successful prosecution. But I do believe that on this matter, the state's case is quite strong and that they do have sufficient evidence. But yes, like you said and like you've mentioned, happy to see some of the state capture culprits appearing in court.
Now, you say you believe the evidence to be quite strong. You have first-hand knowledge of this case in that you drew up some affidavits, which this is 2 years ago already, that you handed directly to the investigating directorate of the NPA. Why did you go directly, and how is it that you could go directly to the ID?
Yes, maybe we can take this a step or two back. OUTA got involved with investigations with regards to state capture in 2017. We received a copy of the Gupta leaks, started to look into that, and from there on up until now, we're still busy, looking at state capture suspects and activities that took place. After the Gupta leaks in 2017, we filed some criminal complaints with the South African Police Service, around 13 of them. And we could see that it's going nowhere. We were in consultations with the then head of the Hawks, General Matakata, later on with General Labia, also with Brigadier Basi, people who were closely involved with the investigations. But the feedback that we received most of the time is, investigations are ongoing. Then in 2019, Wayne Divenage met up with the newly established ID head, and they had talks, and they approached us and said, if you can assist us, please do. And we looked at the National Prosecuting Act at Section 27 that gives you the permission or, actually quite an invitation to submit any suspected criminal activities to them by the form of, in the form of an affidavit. And that's when we changed our approach. And, we started to prepare Section 27 affidavits and referrals and submitted that to the ID. In total, I think we've submitted 7 or 8 these submissions, and three of them were on Transnet. And yes, here we are, 2 years down the line, and finally we see some of the people in court.
If you could, in as simple terms as possible, for somebody who's not au fait with this particular deal, what what is the allegation of corruption here, or the allegation of fraud or contravention of the PFMA? Where does it stem from in relation to this China Development Bank loan?
This case where the people appeared in court actually stands on three legs. It's the China Development Bank loan. Then it was a so-called club loan, and after that, the interest rate swaps. Now, it started off way back in 2014 when Transnet was negotiating with the China Development Bank to get a loan to finance the acquisition of the locomotives, especially those coming from China. Those talks broke down under the then treasurer of Transnet, Ms. Evelyn Magatu. She just said this is too expensive. Transnet cannot afford this, and they moved on and they looked for other financiers. Then, at the end of 2014, December 2014, former President Zuma went on a state visit to China, and thereafter that, the negotiations with China Development Bank picked up again. By that time, Magatu resigned, and Petolo Ramasebudi was appointed as the new treasurer. Talks started again, and under the leadership of Arnosh Singh and Ramasebudi, they went over to China. They closed the deal at terms, that were shot down by Magatu at the previous year. Um, the involvement then was from regiment side, and Ramasebudi motivated a 189 million fee for regiments for arranging this loan, although regiments didn't play a huge role. But the loan was for $2.5 billion, and the drawdown was only negotiated or taken up for $1.5 billion. The other $1 billion, and that's where the club loan comes in. Transnet decided to, on a consortium of banks inside South Africa, to get the money locally. And there again, Ramasebudi motivated for a fee of 93 million rand, this time to trillion. And then that is where these kickbacks were paid to these companies. From there on, these money it was distributed to several companies and entities. Cuban Moodley of Albertine received a lot of the funds. He redistributed it back to Sahara Computers, to Salim Essa. Some money went into the local money laundering network established by the Guptas and by Salim Essa. And yes, that's where the charges stem from.
When we talk about the terms of this loan, the China Development Bank loan weren't really favorable to South Africa and obviously to the taxpayer ultimately. How much more expensive are we talking? I've read through your affidavit. Is it correct to state that it was 3 times more expensive than anything else that was offered on the market?
At that time, that also came from the testimony at the State Capture Commission of Ms. Magatu and Mr. Mohammedi, who said that this was so expensive, Transnet could actually not afford it. And not only the CDB loan, but on the club loan, the local consortium of banks that financed Transnet, there it was, the loans was dealt or it was on a fixed, on a floating rate term. And then the swaps came in and they changed the floating rate to a fixed rate, and that cost Transnet even more. If we think that the interest rates went down during COVID last or the past 2 years significantly, and this interest rates were stuck on, I think, 12, 13% at the time. So it's costing Transnet, and it will cost them for the next 15 years to pay back all this money.
The state visit the president, former President Jacob Zuma, undertook to China, he took Anuj Singh with him. But am I correct to say he also took another gentleman with him, somebody who would sign off on paperwork just before he is spirited away from Transnet to take up the position at Eskom? What can you tell us about that?
Yes, this state visit, former President Zuma was accompanied by a lot of businessmen and politicians. Mr. Brian Molefe, the then CEO of Transnet, also accompanied him. And in a meeting with the governor of the China Development Bank, it was Mr. Molefe, Mr. Singh, and the then former finance minister Nene, who attended that meeting.
So if Brian Molefe and Anuj Singh's, let's call it, fingerprints are all over this. I mean, the signature of Brian Molefe is literally on the document. Surely they are conspicuous by their absence in the doc on this one. You actually gave a list of 17 people to the National Prosecuting Authority. I count 5 of them from the list that you gave to the NPA to say these esteemed gentlemen should be investigated. Daniel Roy is not one of them, so he's a bonus on the list. But why no Molefe? Why no Singh? What do you think, Mr. Heineke?
The spokesperson for the NPA said, that there will be more arrests, and I think that they are getting their, if I can call it, their ducks in a row for the next appearance on the 13th of July. And I do believe that some of the names that we have listed, will be there. One must remember that, an affidavit and information that we gave the NPA, this is not a docket. There's some investigations to be done, some confirmations, some other affidavits that must be obtained. So this is just a guideline and, a referral to the ID to say this is what we suspect. So I do believe that they are, well on their way to complete this, and that they will put more people in the dock in the next appearance.
There's so much expectation from the South African public that I'm very glad to speak to you at a time when finally we've got a little bit of good news. The Tegeta, Transnet, Nulane, or Island Site Asset Recovery, I just want to go through each of those. And this is to break it down for a member of the public who doesn't know the intricacies of it. We don't have to go into too much detail, but just what you can tell me about. Let's start with Tegeta. 3 people arrested there, 2 so-called Gupta acolytes and 1 former DDG. What's that case all about?
So you'd remember at the State Capture Commission, you heard testimony from the likes of Mr. Francis Carlard from Transnet, who was saying that during the procurement of the 1064 locomotive deal, Transnet had a wealth of accountants and or financial advisors who could have given sound advice into what or how to go about getting funding for the 1064 locomotive deal. So what the recent Transnet trillion matter basically looks at is the advisory services provided by a Trillion Capital to Transnet, or alleged advisory services provided for a portion of that, so advisory service for about 93.4 million. In how to go about getting this club loan or loan to fund the 1064 locomotive deal. So what we're saying in that chart sheet is simple, that these people came, piggy-banked on another former contractor's work, which is regiments, and then scored 93.4 million for doing absolutely nothing. Then about 70 odd million was then taken to or laundered into the bank account of Albert Time, which is owned by Kubenter and Moodley, and then it just goes on and on and on. So that particular case just talks about how the advisory services, so purported, were invoiced twice. Transnet was invoiced twice for the same work. First by Regiment, about 189 million, and then by another company, 93.4 million, for doing nothing. So that whole exercise and all of the accused that were brought to court just last week, it's just about the signing off, the breach of the Public Finance Management Act. It's the fraud, misrepresentation of what it is a company did. It's the then laundering the money to conceal where it came from to benefit other people in an illegal manner. So that is what that particular case is about, that single transaction.
And that is the most recent arrest of, I think it was about 5 former Transnet executives, and that's Siyabonga Gama, Gary Peter, Petolo Ramosabudi, Eric Wood, Ramosabudi, and Daniel Roy. In relation to Tegeta and the rehabilitation fund, what is that all about?
So that is another interesting matter. It talks about how mines are supposed to have a trust while they're in operation, even after they're in operation, in order to then rehabilitate that particular environment. If there may be issues in terms of pollution, in terms of the water, that fund is dedicated to address those issues, environmental issues that affect that community, as well as the aftermath of what would have happened in order maybe to rehabilitate the mine to work when somebody else buys it. So those funds have a dedicated purpose, and there's actually legislation that says what needs to happen to that particular trust and how it needs to be used. So that case is simply about how a former Mineral Resources DDG signed off, approved the money taken out of 2 trusts, which is one for Goronfontein and another for Optimum Coal Trust. Both those trusts were supposed to be used for that particular thing that I mentioned. However, the money, the first about 100 million, was used for a down payment, if you will, or a guarantee for the purchase of Optimum Coal Mine, which is in breach of that legislation. Secondly, another tranche of it was used in order to help finance another mine, which the Guptas had their sights on. So basically, that whole case is about an accounting official who was supposed to have known better, who was supposed to have read through the documents thoroughly, who was supposed to have considered the fact that this is in breach of what this trust is for, and I cannot then sign off on these funds. And then the other people who are there are the former trustees of these 2 accounts, who also know that when you take up this position, you're supposed to know what exactly needs to happen with the assets, with the money that is held in this particular, those 2 trusts. So that's essentially what that particular case is about, a single transaction. So what we're doing as the ID, in order to not get things confused, and there's so many illegalities that took place, we need to focus. This is a transaction. These are the people that should be held accountable and should be brought to court.
Island Site Investments. It was many years ago, but I remember Duduzane Zuma being involved with Island Site Investments. I think he sold off his shareholding there at some point. But Island Site Investments, or what is called Nulane, is also arrests were made in that respect. What's that case about?
The Nulani matter is basically about how 24.9 million was siphoned out of the Department of Agriculture for the benefit of Nulani Investment, owned by Iqbal Sharma, as well as for what then happened, how the money then flowed to various companies owned by the Gupta family, and then into a company called Island Site, which we have on good authority is a company owned by the Gupta brothers. So the feasibility study case was about a feasibility study assessment done by Deloitte through subcontracting by Nulani for a fraction of the price, and then the money was then taken up significantly to about 24.9 million. Invoice to the Department of the Free State of Agriculture. They signed off, Peter Tabete and crew, and then the money was paid off, and then it left our shores. So the asset forfeiture matter is premised on what then happens to the money, who then benefits. Because asset forfeiture, it's not necessarily about just the criminality, it's about who then benefits, and each and every person that benefits, then you can have an asset recovery case or claim against them. We got an unlimited restraint order against Island's Nulani, firstly, Iqbal Sharma in his personal capacity, his wife's assets because they are married. We also got it against Island Site, the company owned by the Guptas, and the business rescue practitioners, which are currently looking after caretaking Island Site. So what has since happened is we got the unlimited restraint order last year. We went to court in August last year. The Guptas then came to court, fought us on the fact that their directors should be able to say what happens to their assets. The court found against them, and it's so you'd expect that the Guptas would do nothing less but to continue to try fight us to not get those full hand on those assets, because once the interim restraint order is gotten, the second part is the confirmation of the restraint. After confirmation of the restraint, the next part is that once we win the criminal case, or should we win the criminal case, then we can go into forfeiture. So we're now still being stalled on the confiscation space. We're going to be in court later, the last part of this year, for arguments in that regard. So those are the two. For me, it was the highlights of what the investigating directorate was able to get, because for starters, I'd never heard of an unlimited restraint order, and there hadn't been an unlimited restraint order because the court had in mind or realized that as a state, we still have to ascertain what assets abroad could form part of this restraint.
Speaking about assets abroad, the Guptas, can you give us some sort of an update on just the state of play regarding the red notice?
So we got the red notices issued by Interpol in February this year. We had initially requested for 8 people who are currently out of the country. This is 4 Indian nationals who are business persons, quote unquote, for the various companies in which the money was laundered. Then the 2 Gupta wives and the 2 brothers. We don't have anything on the other Gupta brother. So we only requested for the 8. Interpol has granted us 6 red notices. The first 4 were granted last year already. The last 2 of the Guptas was this year in February. So Interpol has started its work of talking to various member states across the globe to basically ascertain where these to ascertain where they are in the world. They have gotten some responses, however, they're playing their cards very close to their chest.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the budget of the ID, I know that the former head of the ID, Herman Krunier, spoke at length in Parliament about you can't expect us to win these battles if we don't have enough budget for this, to get the right staff, resource them properly. The new head, Andrea Johnson, she came in a couple of months ago. How's that transition been? Is it a sign that things are working, that there's a snowball effect at the ID with these 3 cases, Tegeta, Transnet, Nulane? Is there a snowball effect? Can South Africans take heart that things are happening?
So credit needs to be given to the former ID director for starters. She came into an empty institution. She actually came into an empty nothing, where she then had to build from scratch. You'd know that in 2008, after the Scorpions were disbanded, the NPA Act was amended significantly to not allow for the NPA to be able to hire criminal investigators. So you then, when the ID was born in 2019, mid-year, the ID director first had to establish a team. The proclamation says that we ought to investigate and prosecute matters emanating from high-profile corruption, state capture, SARS, the Nugent Commission, and various other commissions so cited, and other high-profile complex corruption. So what this meant is that you're coming into an institution where it's first built or created in the NDPP as office, which means that it's created in the NPA. You now have a legislative issue, a gap, where you cannot be hiring criminal investigators. You now have to find ways in order to be able to do your work. So a lot of begging, a lot of finding the right people, if you were, to assist you to establish the institution took place. So for the first good 2.5 years of the ID was the building of the institution. You needed to get secondments from the Hawks, secondments from SAP, secondments from IPID. You also had to get FIC to come on board for their money laundering expertise in order for them to also check what happens in the banking sector. Because we must also be cognizant of the fact that the companies and or banks were enablers of state capture. So you now have to get various persons, including SARS, to come on board to help you find how much of these companies, which are quote unquote apparently companies, actually declared to tax if they're actual companies. So the first 2.5 years were the building phase. The second part, which we're now in the second phase of the ID, where it's now everything we've built, the cases that we've started working on are now showing or bearing fruit. Mulani did, ID director left, new ID director started, whose main focus is on criminal cases. Prior director focused on the asset recoveries because that's also her forte. You come in, you do what comes naturally to you. So the second director is now focused on criminal cases, making sure that these matters become or get enrolled, because you know, looking at her track record, that she is not somebody that shies away from a fight, especially a politically linked fight, if you were. She's one of the people that took on Jackie Selibe. So you'd expect that now criminal cases are to be enrolled. All of the groundwork had been done. It's just a matter about tweaking, refining, directing, having proper direction, removing some, adding some, refining charge sheets. So what we are now doing as the ID is striking with every arsenal we possibly can.
Lovely. And we hope that nothing is withdrawn, that the South African people are very patient, and the patience has been tested. But as long as cases are brought eventually and those cases are rock solid and are not withdrawn at a later time, I think that would be anybody's concern. My last question, Cindy, more arrests. Conspicuous by their absence in the dock are certain people. One went looking for a Shabin, Brian Malefe. Anuj Singh joined him at Eskom when he was seconded there. Brian Malefe, Anuj Singh, and others whose names have become household names at the state capture inquiry. What can we expect?
So certainly more names. We did promise court that by the 13th of July, we're going to have more people in the dock. We've also promised the nation through the NDPP as well as Advocate Andrea Johnson in Parliament a few weeks ago that the seminal matters or priority matters will be enrolled within the next 6 months. 2 from the ID have been enrolled. I must also caution the country that the seminal matters so enrolled will not just come from the ID, the NPA, law enforcement in its totality. However, 2 have been enrolled by the ID, and more can be expected. We literally have a target on our backs. People are working around the clock. We have been giving marching orders, constantly reminded that if it means working on a weekend, that's what will be done.
Fantastic. We look forward to that. Sindisiwe Seboka, spokesperson for the ID, thank you so much for your time. Look forward to chatting to you again.
Thank you so much.
All right, so you're clearly not too inspired by the recent arrest of people who, it could be argued, are very senior, even though we do not yet have people like Brian Malefe, like Anuj Singh, like the Guptas themselves in the dock. But Siyabonga Gama, the former group chief executive of Transnet, that's still quite a big fish, don't you think?
No, I think he was a foot soldier of state capture. I'm not impressed. When you see Guptas and Watsons and Steinhoff execs and members of the current cabinet in the dock, then I'll be impressed. But nobody's got the necessary wherewithal. And look, the criteria that were set are actually very easy to understand. We've turned it into a 5-letter acronym that I've bored you with before, but for the benefit of your viewers and readers who do not follow this arcane corner of law, STIRS is the criteria, or was the acronym for the criteria, and the first S in STIRS is for specialists. Now, we don't have more than a handful of specialists in the NPA. The Chief Justice has said you're going to need an army of prosecutors to deal with my report in the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. Now, there is no army of prosecutors, and there is certainly no army of specialist prosecutors who would be able to take on the heavyweight silks who will be engaged by the corrupt to defend them and to throw sand in the gearbox of any prosecution that is mounted. So the first S is a very important S, and it is one that the NEC of the ANC has recognized expressly. The T is for training. Well, you're not going to have specialists if they're not trained, and certainly training has to be ongoing because corrupt people are forever finding new ways of being corrupt. The I in STIRS is independence, and that means the ability to act without fear, favor, or prejudice. It means being free of executive interference or influence, being above politics, which is what the Scorpions were able to do. The Scorpions actually went after the Travelgate fraudsters. They went after Jacob Zuma and his pals, and for their trouble, they got closed down. And that is because they did not have secure tenure of office, which is the S, the final S in STIRS. And the R in between the I and the final S is for guaranteed resources that are adequate to enable, to put petrol in the tank of the S. And if those are regarded as binding, as they should be, because they are what has been laid down by the Constitutional Court in a majority judgment, admittedly so, but the majority judgment counts and the minority judgment doesn't. So if there's a majority judgment to that effect that has been confirmed in later litigation, then failure to implement it is in breach of the interpretation of the Constitution that was worked out in that joint judgment of Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke and Judge Cameron. And that means that as we sit here today, the failure to implement lays the government, certainly the legislature, open to litigation to get the Constitutional Court to order them to do what was required of them all those years ago. The fact is, the politicians have recognized that. And what is lacking at the moment, and I think it's a question of paralysis from factionalism within the ANC ranks, that is what's holding it up. An emerging consensus on the political side is being retarded by the internal politics of the ANC, and it really is time to put bills before Parliament so that they can be debated, so that the public participation process can be rolled out, and so that we can have a Chapter 9 Integrity Commission this year, not one day after the elections or after the conference of the ANC, but now. There's no question of what needs to be done. It's very clear what needs to be done. It's a question of getting the political will generated to make it happen in the time frame that will save South Africa from failed statehood.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.